To get to diplomacy, there must always be a debate. In 1917, British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, which started the Arab-Israeli conflict. This declaration, written on November 2nd, 1917, stated that the Jewish could establish a Jewish state in Palestine. On May 14, 1948, Jewish colonizers declared Israel's founding. The Arab countries refused and announced war against Israel after Israel's proclamation of statehood. On the night of the 14th to 15th of May, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt all invaded territory in the former Palestinian ground. After 9 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days of numerous bloodshed, the war ended with Israel's triumph on March 10, 1949. That is when Israel became an independent state. 7 years later, on October 29, 1956, the Second Arab-Israeli War began. The Suez Crisis began when Israeli forces pushed into Egypt toward the Suez Canal, after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal. The Israelis were joined by the French and British forces, which nearly brought the Soviet Union into the conflict and damaged the relationships with the United States. For 3 months, the leading countries fought bravely. After the success of Israel and the occupation of Sinai by Israel, the United States of America enforced Israel to withdraw from Sinai on November 7, 1956. On May 30th, 1967, a defense pact was signed by the President of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and King Hussein of Jordan, followed on June 4th by a defense pact between Cairo and Amman. Against this backdrop, the United States feared a major Arab-Israeli confrontation and asked Israel to delay military action. Threats and provocations continued to escalate until the 5th of June, 1967, when Israel sent massive air assault against Egyptian airfield. Within 3 days, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula. Israel then attacked Jordan and occupied the West Bank and Old City before Jordan accepted a ceasefire on June 7th. Following the Arab defeat, the occupation of Palestine, and the occupation of territories in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, the overall consequence of the war weighed heavily on the Arabs. On September 28, 1970, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser passed away and was soon replaced 17 days later by Anwar al-Sadat on October 15, 1970. On October 6, 1973, on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, a two-pronged assault on Israel was launched. At 2 p.m. sharp, Egyptian aircraft had set off across the Suez Canal. Egyptian forces struck eastward across the canal while the Syrians advanced north. These attacks caught the Israelis off guard, and it took the country several days to fully mobilize their armed forces. On April 11, 1974, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir resigned her post as the leader of Israel, and a few years later, Menachem Begin took over the job on June 20, 1977. "This is an inevitable step for me," she had said. "This is a burden I no longer want to bear. Don't ask me to change my mind. This is final." In November, fighting continued on the Syrian front until a ceasefire was negotiated between Egypt and Israel in 1974, which caused Israel to withdraw from the canal.
وكان ما كناش مصدقين ان احنا هنقدر نعمل خط بارليف ولا كنا هنقدر نهزم اسرائيل ولا كنا هنقدر نفاجئهم.
After the Arabs' triumph, the UN peacekeeping force was put in between the two armies to barricade further attacks on September 4th, 1975.
تدهش إسرائيل حينما تسمعني لا أقول أمامكم أنني مستعد أن أذهب إلى بيتهم إلى الكنيسة ذات.
On the evening of November 19, 1977, Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat made history by being the first Arab leader to visit Israel. In his autobiography, In Search of Identity, el-Sadat says, "In the afternoon I went to Knesset. I made my speech, which was followed by speeches from Premier Begin and opposition leader Peres. In spite of the great emotional and physical fatigue, I felt very happy indeed."
I'm feeling that this is a sacred mission because, as I said, the alternative is horrible.
Of course, Egypt is the largest and strongest Arab country neighboring with Israel, and we are very interested in having peace with Egypt and friendship too.
Despite criticism from neighboring Arab countries, al-Sadat continued to make peace with the Israeli Prime Minister.
لقد جئت إليكم لكي نبني معا السلام الدائم العادل حتى لا تراق نقطة واحدة من دم أي.
And on September 17, 1978, the two leaders met again in the U.S. to negotiate an agreement with U.S. President Jimmy Carter at Camp David, Maryland. At the brink of failure, when Sadat threatened to leave, and Carter was planning to return to the White House and suffer the political consequences of failure, an agreement was finally formed on the last day, when at the last minute, Begin agreed to allow the Knesset to decide the fate of the settlements Israelis had established on the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt agreed to recognize Israel as an official nation, and Israel agreed to withdraw its troops from the Sinai Peninsula. They eventually established the Camp David Accords, the first peace agreement between Israel and its neighboring Arab countries. This was the official framework for peace in the Middle East. The framework for peace in the Middle East had three parts: a process for Palestinian self-government in the West Bank and Gaza, a framework for the conclusion of peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, and a similar framework for peace treaties between Israel and its other neighbors. On March 26, 1979, the three leaders Anwar el-Sadat, Jimmy Carter, and Menachem Begin stood at the White House to sign the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. They joined hands and shared big smiles. Sadat and Begin were awarded the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for their accomplishments.
Today we celebrate a victory, not of a bloody military campaign, but of an inspiring peace campaign. The dedication and determination of these two world statesmen have borne fruit. Peace has come to Israel and to Egypt.
Let there be no more suffering or denial of rights. Let there be no more despair or loss of faith. Let no mother lament the loss of her child. Let there be no more wars or bloodshed between Arabs and Israelis.
No more war, no more bloodshed, no more bereavement. Peace unto you. Shalom, salam forever.